Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending this conference. And right now we have the Blockchain Cybersecurity and Privacy panel session. And heading us up with this is Dr. Michael Ramalho. So I'll hand the mic over to you, Michael. Take her away.
Well, thank you very much, David. I appreciate that as I read my screens here. So thank you for that introduction and introducing this panel today on blockchain governance, impacts on security and privacy. I come to you from the Florida West Coast, the IEEE Florida West Coast section of blockchain, where I'm blockchain community lead. I tend to teach graduate students on the fundamentals of blockchain, and they're very interested, but primarily on currencies. So this session is blockchain governance, and I'd like to broaden that phrase, blockchain governance, and not just imply the governance of a given blockchain, but also the decisions upon what kind of technology gets put into the blockchain. So we have 4 panelists along with me today. You'll see their names: Anna, Gary, Mick, and Michael here. I will introduce them at greater length later on, and they will talk about their specific areas of expertise in regarding blockchain governance and such issues. But I do want to bring out one thing. The first panelist, Anna and Michael, are actually legal people. So they tend to live in the here and now world with public blockchains, although they do advise clients on what technologies to and the implications of certain technologies that they might want to put into their blockchain. But the middle two, Gary and Mick, are implementers and or architects. So to talk about those differences, I've decided that I should kick off the panel with a little bit of context. Earlier today, you might have seen some of the talks that talk about public permissionless blockchains, like all the cryptos, and then all the other blockchains. But I think a finer stratification of the blockchains and the blockchain technology is useful here. So I've outlined the 4 major kind of taxonomies for blockchains. And the first one is the public permissionless blockchain. The examples being all the major cryptocurrencies. Think Bitcoin, Ethereum, Algorand, Litecoin, Solera, even Dogecoin. A lot of the students that I talk to, they always just equate blockchain to crypto, but we'll find out that that's not true. But in the public permissionless blockchain, any node is allowed to join and participate in what is called network consensus. The different blockchains will have their different specific mechanisms, be they proof of work or proof of stake or variations thereof. They're fully decentralized, secured, and immutable distributed ledger. So the immutable distributed ledger is a pretty important part of public permissionless blockchains, at least the historical ones. And the transactions in them are what is called pseudo-anonymous. You're known by, in the case of Bitcoin, a Bitcoin address, which happens to be your public key. But everybody knows everybody sees that key. Whether or not they know that that key belongs to you is what is called the pseudo-anonymous. You may be able to figure it out, and some of our panelists may talk to that point later on. But the idea here is you have open ledgers, open to anyone, open network. You could copy the code, run it on your CPUs and GPUs at home, and join some of these networks freely. And I don't ever want to minimize the genius of Satoshi Nakamoto, which is the pseudonym for the Bitcoin inventor, to make a network that has a secure, distributed, immutable ledger when they're running on machines of various qualities. Some of them might be nefarious, some of them may be down at a given instant. The process by which all of this works is truly amazing. And so we're going to find problems with public permissionless blockchains, but I've got a great admiration for all of them. On the other side of the blockchain spectrum is something that's a private permissioned blockchain. You'll find these a lot in enterprise. A good example might be a supply chain ledger for components for a given industry. So you make refrigerators. You may have inside of them a refrigerant system. You may have a compressor. Inside the compressor may be motors. Inside the motors may be brushes. And every one of those parts can be put on blockchains. You could find out their provenance, when they were made, when they were shipped, when they were transported, when they were integrated into a given refrigerator. And that's very useful for a lot of companies. So there's economic value to private blockchains that have nothing to do with crypto. And in between those two ends of the spectrum, there are things in the middle. One very important type of blockchain is called a federated blockchain, where it's a blockchain that multiple organizations use but are closed outside of the federation. And you can see lots of examples of this. For example, maybe you are in energy trading and you've got a bunch of energy different partners, and they all decide to be a part of this consortium and decide to use a certain blockchain for that purpose. So if you look at the difference between a private blockchain where there's a single organization in control, and only a few users or entities are allowed to access the blockchain, a single organization is in control, normally the manufacturer, what I mentioned before. The federated blockchain is a little bit different. The federation controls via rules what's allowed, what kind of access, and what kind of network operations such as consensus is used on the blockchain. It's also decentralized much faster than public blockchains. It can have an open ledger or a closed ledger, or parts of the ledger can be open or closed. There's multiple organizations, but it's a closed network. The federation itself controls the degree of privacy, security, and ledger visibility. These blockchains are also called consortium blockchains. So you see, the federation blockchain has, for example, maybe your state government, and you have various different arms of the government. All of them need access to this blockchain, but they're all quarantined off as to what it is they can and can't see. You also see this in healthcare consortium blockchains, given HIPAA and other laws. And then you've got hybrid blockchains that are in between those two extremes. So it's not just crypto and everything else. There's crypto, there's private blockchains, there's federated and hybrid blockchains. Also, to kind of set the stage of what we'll be talking about is the governance of these three major types, the public, federated, and hybrid blockchains. We're not going to be talking so much about the private blockchains because the private blockchains can lock down everything, right? So you don't have quite as many security and privacy concerns if the only thing that's allowed on your blockchains are things that you've allowed on your blockchain. So for the panel, what we'll be discussing today, we're talking mostly about public, federated, and hybrid blockchains. So most people in this conference know generally what a decentralized autonomous organization is, or DAO. It's a member-owned community that's spun up for any purpose whatsoever. You can be a kind of a guild of songwriters, and you build an organization to sell the rights to songs, or you could be an artist and do the same thing for artwork, or maybe a clothing manufacturer or doing that. And lots of these DAOs actually run on and count on underlying blockchains. But this whole concept of decentralized autonomous organizations is pretty important. They're transparent, they're ensconced on rules on the blockchain. So you're part of this, you've agreed to and trust the blockchain to do certain things for you. But it's controlled by organization members and generally not influenced or controlled by a central government. These people can be in this guild, can be wherever they are in the world, in whatever jurisdiction they are in the world, and they just decide to run their DAO a certain way. And the financial records and all the transactions are on the blockchain. So that's a general DAO, but each one of these blockchains has its own governance. And some of the governance of some of those blockchains also can be thought of as a DAO, as an organization, as a structure that governs the blockchain. So in terms of federated and consortium blockchain governance, the security, privacy, and identity requirements are defined by the needs of the federation. They may or may not intend to comply to the financial legal regulations of any given jurisdictions. These are just a blockchain has decided to form some form of federation, and they have themselves their own requirements for what the blockchain needs to do, but they don't necessarily try to be all things to all people because they have certain requirements, and as long as those requirements are met, they'll be happy. So Gary actually will be talking about this very point on our panel later on. But if you talk about public permissionless blockchain governance, think the major cryptos again. It's an open source platform governance, kind of similar to the internet governance model, if you're familiar with that, and not I am. But generally, the internet isn't governed by any particular government, and that's a truly inspirational thing, of which I think the blockchain governance people have taken inspiration from. So each blockchain adopts its own form of governance of their blockchain. Generally, this is an open internet governance model. So, for example, in Bitcoin, some people will propose improvements of the protocols. They call them BIPs, Bitcoin Improvement Protocols. Same thing for Ethereum. There'll be a bunch of people debating these sorts of things. And then once you decide, oh, that's a good thing to implement, then the implementers or the developers actually build that functionality into the network. This is very similar to the Internet RFC model. I forgot, like, I'm author about 6 of those. So it's very, very, very similar. The real question for the 2 lawyers on the panel is that, do proposers, the people that write the EIPs or the BIPs, or the developers, the people that actually ensconce what it is that we've written in this document into code, do they have a fiduciary duty in any or all jurisdictions that their blockchain may be used in, or in all use cases that their blockchain can be used in? This is a very sticky issue. It makes me thankful that people like Anna and Michael Scherman are lawyers, and that I'm not. But the internet went through a very similar phase in its development. There's a very famous French case against Yahoo where they were selling Nazi memorabilia, and it showed up in France, and it's illegal to sell that stuff in France. And well, who's breaking the law here, and can we fix that? So there are other jurisdiction-based expectations for both privacy, GDPR issues. Gary and I think Anna and Michael, certainly Michael will talk to those issues. Things like know your customer, anti-money laundering, which is a specialty of Anna's, we'll find out, etc. So just before we get to our panelists, I want to put a little bit of perspective in where we are here in internet governance. So my question is, have we seen this story before? And I would answer yes. I was around in the internet telephony days in voice over IP, or called VoIP. I was the chair of the VoIP forum at the time. And there was a time where everybody used their own speech or audio signal encoding. Everybody used their own transport. Everybody used their own signaling, their own routing, their endpoint identifications, or IDs or whatnot. But as time progressed, standardized techniques emerged, G729 and Opus in the case of internet of voice, G723 and various signaling protocols. The alphabet soup goes on. I know what each one of those decodes to, unfortunately. But eventually one-to-one integrations emerged after what I'll call this kind of annealing process where you're figuring things out. So one-to-one integrations occurred, then federations and cross-compatibility emerged after that. But I did note that generally the established telcos were not so eager to embrace the technology. They knew that someday we'd be able to do FaceTime or Android video on our smartphones, but they were just, they didn't want to hasten that day. They were making good money doing what it is that they were doing at the time. And maybe some of the large financial services think the same thing about crypto and blockchain. There is this annealing process that the internet went through, not just voice over IP, towards standards. Anybody remember Novel Network IPX before everybody went over to the IP as the internet protocol, as the standard transport? I even remember in the early days of email that we had something that's called a bank style address, which meant that if those intermediate machines, Harpo and Hera, weren't up, and Ramalho was my username on Hera, the email wouldn't get to me. The young folks nowadays can't even imagine a world where that was the case. But think about security and privacy. We had encryption, we had digital signatures, we had certificate authorities, so that you know that when your web browser connected to some other browser, then in fact that it could be trusted. So I think things like certificate authorities and other forms of ID verification will also become standardized in this process. And we learned a whole lot of things, like there are bad people out there. The so-called denial of service attacks and infrastructure hardening had to be done to the internet. All these sorts of things are things that are going to be addressed by the blockchain community, because there are still bad actors out there. So you've got to, and there aren't standardized ways of doing some of these things. But we do have a model. The Web 1 had traversed from a US ARPANET experiment all the way through to now what is global internet governance, where no one governmental authority.
Well, maybe I'll step in here actually, because it seems like we may have lost Michael's connection. I'm sure he'll be joining back right away here. And if I recall correctly from our agenda, he was probably about to pass it over to me right away here anyway to do my a bit of an introduction on my side. I believe his intention was to sort of hand it. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the chat here, and it looks like he's asking for.
Asking to get back on.
There we go.
Hopefully you can see me, and I love your response, Mick Bowen. I absolutely love it. Oh, if anybody could see that, he's saying you must be using IPX. No, this is the host's nightmare when stuff like this happens. Thank you for that. I actually had my mouse die earlier. I couldn't figure it out. Anyway, so I'm almost at the point where I was going to pass it off to people. Thank you for doing that. But I do want to ask, is it different this time? Have we seen this story before? And maybe. However, the stakes are much higher for crypto. When we were doing voice over IP and the voice over IP app crashed, you didn't have a conversation. You didn't lose tens of millions of dollars. So I don't know what inning we're in, to use a baseball analogy of a nominal 9-inning baseball game, but I think we're no greater than the third inning. So with that inevitable burp that happens to the hosts. Everybody just go, the panelists, can you just give me a thumbs up so that you do hear me good? We'll actually get to the meat of this panel and actually talk about internet governance. And as I said before, the two legal folks here are Anna and Michael, so I'm going to introduce them first, and then I'll get to Gary and Mick and after that. So the format will be, I'll introduce them. They will talk about 10 minutes to their area of expertise on blockchain governance. And then when they're done, I'll go to the next person and they'll do the same. And after all four people have introduced themselves and their topics for today, then I have a series of questions and answers. Before I get to that point though, anybody who has questions as they speak, as the panelists speak, put them in the chat and we'll be sure to get to as many of them as we can before the end of the session. So first is going to be Anna. Anna is co-leads McCarthy Detroit's LLP's National FinTech Group. She's a partner in their financial services group and a certified anti-money laundering specialist. She advises clients on financial services entities, including financial institution and fintech entities, on regulatory compliance matters, including the respect of to consumer protections, anti-money laundering, and other regulatory requirements. She holds a Master of Laws, an LLM degree in banking and financial law from Boston University, and also a Bachelor of Legal Matters, LLB, from Osgood Hall Law School, and a BMath, which is really an operations research degree from the University of Waterloo. So Anna will talk about how blockchains transactions are currently regulated and how they've been regulated until now, and then some of her activities beyond that. So Anna, I'm going to unshare and let you take it over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael, and great to be here today. I'll do kind of a quick fly through from a regulatory perspective of how blockchain technology and associated use cases are regulated. I'll give the perspective from my end, which is I am a Canadian lawyer, but there are a lot of similarities across jurisdictions, and that's one point I will touch on. So at a high level, really the two main areas of law that have been engaged to date are primarily anti-money laundering legislation and securities legislation. And anti-money laundering legislation is an area of law that's really intended to help prevent money laundering and terrorist financing, and applies to a whole series of different industries. And most recently has been really a focus in terms of looking at the virtual currency industry in particular and crypto, but can have widespread implication beyond kind of a traditional crypto token. There's a pretty broad definition of what gets captured under virtual currency, and a lot of focus by regulators. And some of the focus really dates back to some of the kind of early use cases being tied to some nefarious activity in the space. In particular, Silk Road attracted a lot of attention from regulators. And so we've definitely seen a big move into this space in imposing a number of requirements in respect of blockchain transactions and anti-money laundering legislation requirements. So everything from KYC to reporting to regulators and having in place a variety of compliance type programs. Turning from anti-money laundering legislation to securities, that's the other area where we've seen a large amount of focus to date. And securities regulation, really the focus there, unlike AML, is the focus on securities regulation is in protecting investors. And some of the application has been, I'll back up. The application of securities laws is very fact-based. So it really depends on whether or not there is an underlying security. And so that's really been an evolving conversation, but it's really driven by this investor protection goal. And so where we've seen some activity that, for example, has resulted in losses to individuals or businesses that would hold say a token. So really, I think what really attracted the attention was the initial coin offering craze in the late 2018. So that has really led securities regulators to really focus in on this space and again, seek to capture the industry in terms of ensuring that there are a series of protections put in place. And so really, again, we're seeing regulators kind of step in because they've seen activity that concerns them. And some of the big drivers that we've seen, so in Canada, would be what happened with Quadriga, which was an exchange that a lot of people are familiar with. The founder died suddenly, and after his death, it turned out that there was widespread fraud, and a lot of that cryptocurrency that had been held through that exchange was never recovered, and there had been a series kind of activity that were very much the kind of activity that regulators probably stay up at night worrying about. And so Quadriga in Canada has been a big driver of how regulators look at this space and ensuring that people are protected. Another driver would be the DAO. And so the DAO that would be in the US, there is a big report by the SEC that's quite informative on the DAO. And that was a token issuance that happened, I think, late 2018, where essentially there was a compromise of the underlying technology resulting in draining of the wallet, which was halted because of some of the underlying technology. And I'm sure some of my co-panelists are closer to it than I. but really led to, at the time, the forking of the Ethereum blockchain into Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. So a technical solution to what regulators would have worried about in other contexts. So they did a report as kind of a postmortem and decided not to pursue any sort of regulatory penalties or fines. But again, it illustrates the concerns that they're concerned about and the finding that those types of tokens could be securities and therefore would fall under their bailiwick. And then stepping beyond that, there are a whole series of other legal areas that get engaged when we're dealing with this technology. And a number of them would be what we refer to as laws of general application. They apply to everybody. So tax law is always a big area of focus because depending on how you're transacting, there may be various tax implications. Criminal law obviously would still apply regardless of whether an entity is captured under anti-money laundering legislation. So we've seen some actions on the criminal law sanctions front. Consumer protection laws. So regardless of whether or not you've got a security involved, there are also consumer protection laws that may cover individuals that may be involved in the ecosystem. Privacy law, I'll let Michael speak to that further as we talk through. Contract law is a big area of focus depending on how the governance is structured, and that also ties into things like corporate law and partnership law, depending on the structure of, say, a DAO. It may be a partnership, or it may be a corporation, depending on how it's been structured. So that's an area that gets tied in as well. And then sanctions laws as well. So sanctions are essentially prohibitions on doing a certain type of activity with either listed individuals or listed jurisdictions. A lot of new sanctions have come in the last year with respect to Russia. But in the crypto context in particular, we've seen a sanctioning of Tornado Cash, which has been interesting. Typically, you would sanction an individual and not a technology. And so, a bit of a shift in approach there, which has some interesting implications as well. And then in some jurisdictions, we're seeing legislation that's specific to this context, either crypto or blockchain. So, one well-known example would be the BIT license in New York. Definitely seen more in the US in terms of industry-specific legislation. And then, touching back to governance, I had mentioned, partnership law or corporate law. So when you've got a partnership, you would typically have joint liability with your partners. And so if a decentralized autonomous organization happens to be a partnership in the way that it's conducting its business, because it's not a form of corporation, for example, and there are indicators that suggest that it's a partnership, then you've got, some governance risks there where essentially all of the holders may be sharing liability amongst themselves. So I'll pause there. Obviously, a bit of a very quick fly through, but I'll turn it back to probably Mike and Mike to talk through what I think is probably a deeper dive on the privacy side.
Yes, so thank you very much. I actually wrote down like 3 other questions to ask you on that. It's very interesting. So for people that don't know what Tornado Cash is, maybe Michael will address that, but as a way to kind of hide transactions, and they're very similar to something called mixers that I'm pretty sure that either Anna or Michael Scherman will address in their either in their commentaries or in their questions later on. So next I'm going to progress to Michael Scherman and ask him to do basically the same thing. Michael is a lawyer with the certified information and also a certified information privacy professional, which is a CIPP, and is a partner in the technology law and cyber data groups of McCarthy Titteralt, LLP, a large Canadian law firm. He has deep expertise in providing legal solutions across a broad range of transactions and areas, including in relation to privacy technology. technology outsourcing, and complex data sharing arrangements. Further, Michael brings specific knowledge and experience in addressing the unique concerns posed by emerging technologies, including blockchain and artificial intelligence. He holds a Bachelor of Engineering Physics degree. I don't think I've ever had on one of my panels somebody who had an engineering physics background in a previous life and was an engineer with a large multinational manufacturer of telecom equipment. So we have some commonality in background there. So with that, what I'd like to do is have Michael talk a little bit about those issues. And again, for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll progress to the next panelist. Thanks. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. So first, I just thought I'd start with a bit of a blurb about the type of work that I do, because that really does inform the perspective that I'm coming into this conversation from. So I'm a lawyer. My practice is focused solely on advising businesses in sort of corporate and commercial transactions in the privacy, IT, and data space. This does include an increasingly large amount of work supporting companies working with blockchains, whether that's companies sort of launching and operating their own private blockchains or otherwise operating in the blockchain space. Today, I'm really focusing on the privacy compliance portion of the discussion. Privacy laws, of course, differ wildly around the world, with the GDPR on one end of the spectrum. Some jurisdictions have no privacy laws at all. Canadian privacy laws sort of sit in between those two extremes in a bit of a happy middle. And that's sort of the perspective that I'll try to discuss, sort of that middle of the road type lens to privacy during this discussion. And regardless, I'm not going to try to focus on any particular jurisdictions, laws, or requirements during this session, just really focusing on general sort of foundational principles of privacy law that are pretty fundamental and consistent sort of around the world. So being a Canadian, I'm going to start off maybe my brief blurb with something that's distinctively Canadian, which is an apology. So first of all, given I am the privacy person on a blockchain discussion, I'm necessarily going to be a bit of a wet blanket in this discussion. There is without doubt a path towards privacy laws and blockchains playing nicely together and coexisting. But this is without a question not an easy reconciliation to make. And there is an underlying tension between privacy laws and blockchains. Just as an example, generally privacy laws are structured as having one person responsible for the safeguarding and safe custody of personal information. In the GDPR, this is generally referred to as a controller. Canadian privacy laws don't actually even really have a term for this person. It's really that fundamental to the law that there is one person to look to for privacy law compliance, that they didn't, I guess, even really spend a lot of time labeling what that person would be called. But when we look at that concept of a single entity responsible for privacy law compliance, it's pretty clear right away that there's a fundamental tension with blockchain. I mean, there's so many disparate actors in a decentralized ledger of any kind, really, that saying, you know, this person is responsible for that is very difficult. Also, you know, another example of a tension is just erasure and modification of data. It's a fundamental principle of privacy laws that an individual can correct errors in their personal information. They can, in most cases, request that their information is deleted when they no longer want it to be used for that purpose. I mean, this is in indirect conflict with, you know, the blockchain principles of immutability and permanence that are really required to achieve the trust and data integrity that are necessary for blockchains. So again, that's not to say that there's not a path towards resolving these tensions, but it is a hard path. It does need to be considered right sort of from the outset of discussions, and it will involve some trade-offs. So again, that's why I'm a bit of a wet blanket on this conversation. The second reason I'll apologize is because lots of the discussions around privacy and blockchains end with something along the lines of, well, it's unclear, or well, it depends. I would love to come here and provide like very definitive, clear answers, you know, based on research. This is what needs to be done. But that's just not where we are right now. It is very hard to give definitive answers or clear solutions to some of the issues that are being debated and struggled with in connection with blockchain and privacy. And it's actually not purely a blockchain issue. It just so happens that some of the key areas where there is uncertainty and lots of development and a lot of gray are the exact same areas that blockchain is really acting as a stressor into privacy laws. So there just happens to be that unfortunate confluence of overlap. There are actually a few areas that I think are particularly problematic right now in privacy laws and that blockchain technologies exasperate. The first is the simple question, like, is this personal information? It sounds like an extremely simple question to answer. And in many cases it is, right? If I'm an employer and I'm collecting my employee's name, social insurance number, I know their salary, I probably know their dependents. I mean, this is all personal information, easy question to answer. The problem starts to become a lot more gray when you start talking about pseudonymized data, anonymized data, which is a huge range of, when does something stop becoming personal information? When you're starting to anonymize it, right? When you remove their name, when you change it to a hash function of some kind, like at what point in time can we no longer worry about privacy laws? And this is exactly what blockchains do, right? They're all about anonymized and pseudonymized data. And the state of privacy laws around the world is very unclear right now, exactly what standard is always adopted. It's evolving a ton, and it's open for debate. So that's one area where there is a lot of uncertainty. One person may believe, like, this data is anonymized, it can't be re-identified. Another person may say, no, if I take that data, I recombine it, I do some forensics, I can re-identify that individual. And the problem is that's not a static event. Technology changes, our ability to do this changes. So it's just going to remain a gray area for some time. The second area where blockchains are really playing into an uncertain area in privacy is identifying roles and responsibilities in complex ecosystems. More and more in all of the work that I do, not just blockchain work, it's involving a very big ecosystem of players. Like, take a non-blockchain example that comes up over and over again is in the retail space. So you've got, a merchant that may be selling a good, the storefront may be on a social media platform. There may be a third-party partner doing lots of data exchanges and technology integrations that's involved. There can be a third-party loyalty program that's also layering into all of that. And even like in those examples, identifying who has which rights in respect of which data, who is responsible to which privacy regulators and in what respects. It is not a simple question. Even when you discuss it between all of those parties, there will be disagreements. And blockchain is probably an even more extreme example than anything else you see. You have a ton of parties, very disparate roles, very set roles. So figuring out who is the actual party ultimately responsible for privacy compliance is a major challenge. And then maybe a third area to end with, where blockchains have sort of entered into the deepest part of a privacy nightmare is jurisdictional issues. There's something like a dozen states now that have passed privacy laws, and more are being added every month. Canada, where I'm from, there are 4 key privacy laws, but there's also dozens of other specific privacy laws applicable to governments or healthcare fields or what have you. Worldwide, I think there's something like 120 privacy laws. Not only that, they're constantly changing, constantly being updated, constantly being reinterpreted, and they're not all consistent. There's uniquenesses to all of them. So for a company, like a non-blockchain company that operates in, 10 jurisdictions, this is a huge challenge, trying to keep policies and procedures up to date that are respectful of those 10 countries. Blockchain is, by its very nature, borderless. It will, operate in every one of those countries, or at least has the possibility to operate in every one of those countries. So there are 120 plus privacy laws that are constantly changing that may or may not apply, and do apply or do not apply in different ways. So all that is to say, I'll maybe end there, and then we can delve into some of these issues more in sort of the Q&A section. But I really just wanted to highlight that there is that underlying tension. It is not purely a blockchain problem with privacy law. It is a inherent areas of evolution and lack of clarity in privacy laws right now that blockchain just happens to really like dig its finger into and say, well, why don't I run this to the extreme and push it further? So with that, I'll maybe turn it back over to you, Michael, and looking forward to diving into some of those concerns more in the community.
Excellent, Michael. I think I mentioned earlier in this call that I wouldn't want to be a lawyer in this space. So you've created enough fear in me. The one person responsible in GDPR is kind of amazing, and one of the reasons why I put the commentary at the beginning about, is it the person that proposes the chain or the person that implements the chain? Is it the governance that proposed, that approved of the chain to be change to be put into the blockchain? It's like, this is a true nightmare for a lawyer, and then dealing with all the different jurisdictions and their requirements, and what Anna said, that you have a DAO, but you're effectively a partnership in the eyes of certain jurisdictions' laws. So this stuff really does hurt my brain, and I'm glad that we have people like you dealing with it, because I know that I wouldn't be able to. So the next person I'd like to introduce is Gary Whitsett. Gary has an MBA and is also a CISSP, involved in blockchain community project in Colorado Springs for the past 5 years. It's an information and security kind of certification, the CISSP. That Colorado Spring blockchain community project addresses the needs of the state of Colorado, laid out in its Senate Bill 18-086, which requires blockchain and immutable distributed ledger technology to be incorporated into government programs. Secure blockchain access, security, and other GDPR-like issues need to be addressed day one in the design. Realizing that the current blockchains at the time could not meet those needs, the blockchain development community set out to redesign the blockchain from the ground up, and thus his company Phyllis BDL, Blockchain Distributed Ledgers, the BDL, was born. He's here today to address some of the required changes to existing, mostly federated blockchain technology to meet this Colorado government requirement need. That's the reason why I brought up the federated blockchain part of my intro, because this is the world that Gary lives in. In addition, Gary is also a lead curriculum developer for the Flatiron School, where he offers boot camps in cybersecurity. He develops curriculum for networking systems, application security, cryptology, GRC, and other relevant topics. His background includes KPI, security analysis, and corporate education. So with that, I'll toss it over to Gary and let you talk about your pain points in this project and federated blockchain in general. Thanks.
Well, I'll start with, I'm not a lawyer, but I think Michael Scherman and I have ended up in a similar space, albeit from 2 different perspectives.
Great.
I've been working in IT for 40 plus years. I've been working in cyber for about 25 years. Obviously with the CISSP, I've got a very, very strong security background. And so the privacy I kind of layered on top of that. And so I see all the issues that Michael's brought up. And, I think one of the hardest things from my perspective is both the cybersecurity and the privacy, it seems like those are getting redefined every single day. I mean, every time I think I have my head wrapped around what it means to be secure or what it means to have privacy, we see a new way that that's being applied that changes the landscape significantly. And so that's where a lot of the work that I've been doing with this project has come from. You'll notice I also have the Accord project on there. If you're familiar with that project, they are the next generation of smart legal contracts. They're trying to, it's actually a group of lawyers and tech folks that are working on creating a working smart contract that is legally based and cross-jurisdictional. So it's a pretty ambitious project. I just recently got involved with that one. But you know, again, the issues that I see, I come up through on the security side. So issues of compliance and you know, policy, procedures, things like that. Early on, you know, I don't know that we even gave privacy per se a lot of thought until we started actually using the phrase PII, right? Personally identifiable information, and realized that that was really what we were trying to protect. And so, you know, but even then, again, you know, like Michael was pointing out, so often that becomes, you know, your social security number, your name, your income level, things like that. But I think that one of the issues that I see in that is something that may be not a privacy concern today, that very same thing can be a privacy concern tomorrow in a different context, right? And that's not unlike, you know, when I was in the military and we had layered security there as well, right? So you might have a piece of information that's unclassified here and another piece of information that's unclassified there. But if you put the two pieces together, now you've got a classified document. So, you know, I see a lot of the security and privacy overlapping in that space. So, and I want to be clear that security and privacy are two completely separate entities, but they do cross over a lot. I see it as a big Venn diagram in my head, to be honest. So, you know, I come at everything as from a security concern. Obviously, my background is pretty broad in that. If I'm teaching, creating curriculum in all those different areas, and so when I first became aware of blockchains, well, I read a paper probably 2009, 2010, and dismissed it because all I could see was the dark side of crypto. And I didn't come back around to it until I started writing curriculum around it in late 2016, 2017. And immediately, once I looked at it that second time, I started to see all of the issues on the privacy side that I felt were either being driven by or paralleled the issues on the crypto security side or cybersecurity side. So, you know, again, I kind of came into the privacy organically that way. Once we started developing this blockchain solution and started looking at all the ways that privacy kept rearing its ugly head, that was really where I started getting involved in the privacy side of things and studying a lot of the issues that Michael brought up. I do think that there are solutions out there. I do think that we are on the verge, but I do think that we've got some very choppy waters to go through before we can get to any of those solutions. Mentioned Senate Bill 1886 here in Colorado. That was the first legislation that I was familiar with. I've since looked at, you know, some of the executive orders that are coming down from the feds, that coming out of California, some other areas, along with other legislation. And again, I think, you know, we've got to go through that process of aligning the different jurisdictions, aligning the different needs, and figuring it out, just like we did with the internet, as was mentioned earlier, right? So I think that there's a huge renaissance coming through on the privacy side in particular. And again, I think it's going to have some interesting repercussions over on the cybersecurity side of the world. So, okay, I think that's probably good from my side.
Very, very good. Thanks again, Gary. maybe we're not even in the third inning of this nominal 9-inning ball game, because it sounds like the more that we peel this onion, a lot more questions remain. So I've got a bunch of things on my list to ask for you relative to trust and who can actually change these records, and the whole thing. We're talking about so we're starting to talk about mutable, that is changeable records in one of the prior blockchain talks today. So just a whole lot of trust and certificate authorities verifying the proof of all these abilities of people to change various forms in the blockchain. Our last panelist is someone I think closest to my background, in the sense that I like to get down and write code or do it, or write internet standards to actually, as part of that in the internet telephony world, less so here in the blockchain world. But I'd like to introduce now Dr. Mick Bowman. He's a senior principal engineer working on blockchain technology at Intel Corporation. He's been active, very active for many years in private blockchains. That's another reason why I went through the public-private federated blockchain introduction, where trusted execution environments improve blockchain efficiency, and decentralized compute enable some new technologies such as confidential smart contracts. So a lot of my questions today are, and I would encourage people to ask Mick more about the confidential smart contracts. I don't know why Siri decided to talk to me. And before I even finish, so before I finish this introduction, Mick, I want to make sure that everybody in the chat knows that as they start hearing some of your explanations of your technology expertise, that they ask questions in the chat. Mick also Mick's work is also the basis for something called Hyperledger Avalon, which enables privacy in blockchain transactions in addition to scalability, performance, and Oracle support. And we mean support not to the company Oracle, but rather what blockchains call oracles, which are outside statements of truth, is what I'm presuming that he means by that. And he's especially interested in the privacy and confidentiality aspects of these new confidential smart contract technologies. He tells me that they could be used in both private and in federated, and even in public permissionless blockchains. So with that introduction, I'd like to Mick to take it over for a little bit. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, Michael. So just a couple of things. First is that a panel where everybody agrees is kind of a boring panel. So I'm going to do my absolute best to be the contrarian today. Not that I disagree, okay, just that, we got to have something interesting to talk about on the panel. So one observation is that privacy is a legal and social term, not a technical term. And the problem with that is that appropriate use of data, whether it's personal data or not personal data, appropriate use can be constrained by a lot of different things. Privacy laws must be adhered to in understanding the appropriate use of the data, but they are not sufficient for understanding what we can do and what are the operations that we can perform on the data. So that's observation number one, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Observation number two is that the technologies for enforcing appropriate use that is aligned with legal definitions of privacy has come a long way since we started working on blockchains. We have software-based solutions that use cryptography for things like what we call zero-knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryption. And they give us ways to perform operations on the data and infer information about the data without actually seeing or revealing the confidential or constrained access to the data itself. Now, those technologies are a little hard to use and a little sort of difficult to express. We also have an emerging technology called trusted execution environments that Michael mentioned in that case, which allows us to, again, execute portions of code without others being able to see what's being executed and still verify the outcomes. And I'm not going to go any more into the details of the technology stuff. If you're interested in the specifics on the technologies, either we can either ask it in the Q&A, or I can come back to it offline, and we can discuss it offline that way. But what we have, the tools we have for enforcing appropriate use, where that appropriate use can be derived from privacy legislation or from requirements for protecting intellectual property for a company or an individual. The technologies we have for doing the enforcement of that have come a long ways and have matured tremendously since we started building blockchains 7 or 8 years ago at this point. All right, so let me switch gears for just a second and talk a little bit something that's a little more sort of aligned with the governance notion. So what's the difference between a smart contract and an app? I get asked these questions all the time. So we have smart contracts in blockchains, we have apps that run on our phone. What's really the difference? Well, at the end of the day, they're both code. But what's really different is the sense of agency that we give to a smart contract. The smart contract is something that is given authority to manage a set of interactions between individuals, typically within the context of things like a cryptocurrency or a set of assets or a set of operations that we want to perform on some data that way. The contract, we call it a smart contract because it represents, the code itself represents an agreement about an appropriate set of behaviors and uses for interacting amongst ourselves within the context of digital assets or other things. And we have seen smart contracts that have done everything from literally managing access to data, to managing financial tokens, to managing cryptocurrencies on that. So in this context then, where the smart contracts is really about managing behavior, what's the problem with smart contracts in existing blockchain systems? Well, the problem is that they don't just manage behavior, they also expose the data that goes along with the behavior that's being managed that way. For certain applications, that's completely appropriate. But what we really like to be able to see is not just transparency of the code and behavior, but appropriate use and appropriate controls on the data that's associated with that. And that's where these notions of confidential or private smart contracts start come into play. That what we want to do is to separate out the transparency of the behavior of the smart contract from the data that's underlying it that way. And so just as a couple of concrete examples, we see things like a blind auction, right? So anybody who's gone to Ethereum and tried to write smart contracts, one of the first smart contracts you try to write is an auction contract. Right? We know how auctions work. You bid on something, somebody looks at that high bid, decides whether or not they want to bid more, and they move up that way. That works for many of the kinds of operations or interactions that we have on existing public blockchains. But for things like wireless spectrum auctions or others where we're dealing with some very high value assets where collusion becomes an extremely big problem in that case, we want to protect all of the information about the auction. So you don't get to see what the current high bid is. You have to bid what you believe the value is rather than the current high bid. We can't really do those in existing kind of Ethereum-based contracts. But the idea behind the confidential smart contracts is that we can take the state of that auction, protect the state of that auction, and still expose an appropriate set of behaviors. And so it allows the smart contract to provide the governance for the community independent of the data that's behind that smart contract. We've also seen situations where we're trying to do things with NFTs and tokenizing of data assets that way. And again, most of the time when we look at tokenization of Bored Apes or other things like that, the data that we bind to that token is completely visible to everyone, and you can do whatever you want with it. There was Elon Musk made this big joke about the Bored Apes by grabbing all of the Bored Apes and using it for his Twitter icon for a while. that way, just to show that there really is nothing to this. But when we start to do tokenization of things like medical data for the purpose of driving better federated learning around medical experimentation, or when we want to start doing things like making the classification models that we have from our AI available for use without exposing the intellectual property into it. Now, the data that we're actually transacting is something that's completely confidential. And we want technologies that allow us to get the benefits of tokenization and creating markets for data, but allow us to control explicitly those operations that are being performed on it to just the ones that we allow. And so this is where we come back to what Michael and Anna were talking about earlier, that it's all about appropriate use and how can we encode appropriate use for data that does not require us to expose the actual data itself to it. And all I'll say to that is, as Michael mentioned, there's quite a bit of work that's being done right now. This is one of the more active areas in blockchain development around building these smart contracts that allow us to perform operations on confidential data that adhere to all of those appropriate use requirements that come both from the legal side of things, from sort of corporate intellectual property, and from monetization of data. And a lot of our work is focused on how to deliver those technologies. Thanks.
Okay, so maybe we're not in the third inning, but we're in the fourth inning, right? So I have this game. That's very interesting. I know I've trained neural networks and which need lots of data that ordinarily is confidential or mildly anonymized, that I'm very interested in the appropriate use of some of that technology via smart contracts that still adhere to those legal constraints. So I want to open it up again to anybody on the chat, but I will be and I'm probably changing some of my questions based on what I heard, but we're going to the progressing to the question and answer part of the panel. And until I get people chiming in, I'll ask a few questions. The first one's kind of directed towards Anna, although in this format, anybody who wants to chime in can. And some of these questions I already know that one or two of you will address, but it's really an open season for an answer. So kind of Anna, maybe Diana and Michael, I understand it, most of the challenges of your present position are defined by existing public blockchain governance processes and existing blockchain accounting principles and structures. As an example, Bitcoin and a lot of the cryptos only know you by your blockchain address, which is looks random, but if you make enough transactions, somebody can figure out who you are, and that's why it's called pseudo-anonymous. Can you tell us how such pseudo-anonymity causes difficulty for regulators and things in like anti-money laundering? I'll pass that to Anna.
Sure, thank you, Michael. So from an anti-money laundering perspective, so there's always this tension from between, and we refer to it as AML and privacy to some extent, because from an AML perspective, you're trying to minimize the risk that there is nefarious activity. And if there is, you're trying to increase the risk that you can identify who it is so that those people, essentially the information gets passed on to law enforcement and those people are essentially, caught up within the criminal system. And so when you have a concept like pseudo-anonymity, it's always hard to pronounce, pseudo-anonymity, anyway.
I can't say it either. Pseudo-anonymity. Yes, okay.
Pseudo-anonymity. You've got this real struggle from an AML perspective, because the thing that you want is to actually identify everyone involved in the transactions. And so what we've seen really is regulators imposing requirements that strip away that pseudo-anonymous nature and require actual identification. And so from an AML perspective, to the extent that an entity is captured and subject to it, typically they need to comply with what's known as the travel rule. And the travel rule essentially requires, when you're doing a transaction, for certain information to travel along with the either the funds transfer, or in this case, a virtual currency transfer. And so it's been interesting because it's been a real struggle in this industry to comply with the travel rule, because the whole purpose behind, in particular, the Bitcoin blockchain, was that you didn't have this information traveling along. And so now essentially regulators have reimposed that requirement, which has resulted in people having to either build technology that allows for that information to travel. So you build kind of tack on technology, or sometimes it's very mechanical, and you've got essentially people sending by email information that ties into a transaction that's being sent. And so you're essentially seeing regulators trying to attack that pseudo anonymous nature of the transactions in order to ensure that, from an AML perspective, the right information is available to identify nefarious activity. But you've got that tension, and I'm sure others here can speak more to it. But when you're reinserting that information, you're essentially undermining both kind of the ethos of the transaction or certain blockchains, but you're also creating privacy risk, because at the end of the day, instead of just your public address being sent, you now have some personal information being sent so that you can comply with requirements from an AML perspective. But you've introduced more personal information where there wasn't some before. So happy to kind of turn it to anyone else who may want to speak about it from a privacy perspective. But I think you've kind of got this starting point of pseudo anonymity, and then regulators saying that's not good enough from an AML perspective. But then you're essentially adding privacy risk by complying on the AML side.
So I have a question, Anna, regarding that. So where do you see most of this impact for the regulation? Is it happening at the exchanges or in the blockchains themselves? I mean, I have seen the blockchains are, Bitcoin in particular seems to be going the other direction to create more anonymity, even though the exchanges are at the flip side, being more constrained by the regulatory environments. Where do you see the impact most with the regulatory environments?
So for sure, the exchanges, and they've always been the focus. They're the on-ramp and the off-ramp, and regulators are looking for, and it's not the prettiest of saying, but when throat to choke. And so the exchanges are the handy players for them to focus on for that. They're re-centralizing a lot of the activity, and as a result, taking on a lot more obligations from a regulatory perspective. But you've still got the tension, and what on the AML side there's been a real struggle is trying to understand how to deal with DeFi. And so that's what kind of global regulators are looking at right now, and trying to figure out where is that central entity, or same concept that Michael S. was raising earlier, that one responsible person. And that's been what the AML regulators have been focused on, in trying to make sure that just because you've got decentralization doesn't mean that you can suddenly escape from legal compliance requirements.
Okay, very good. I'm going to ask Mick a question, but just to let you know, there's a question in the chat from Alex Norda that I really want to see answered also. But regarding the confidential smart contracts, Mick, and the appropriate use of if information has been tokenized in some form, it seems to me that you need some infrastructure outside of the blockchain, some sort of trusted authority to approve the unlocking or partially viewing whatever information is in this tokenized asset on the blockchain. Could you talk a little bit about that? I have a hard time believing that the only thing that you need on the smart contract is some trusted, secure operating environment that has world state regarding, for example, the high auction bid price or something like that.
Yeah, so most of the work and okay, there's a short answer to your question, a long answer to your question. A long answer to your question, it involves performance and reliability and a whole bunch of other things that go along with it, right? But the short answer to your question is that most of the work that's being done on confidential computing and confidential smart contracts separates the commitment of a transaction, which is on the blockchain, from the actual operation on the data, which becomes off-chain. And that's true whether it's the Avalon's architecture or there's a new technology that we've been developing for Hyperledger called Fabric Private Chain Code, does a similar thing, and we've got research systems for private data objects. And then there are a number of smart contract layer 2 blockchains that are coming out for confidential computing on data through the smart contracts. And in each case, there's kind of a separation between the notion of commit, which still happens on the chain, and actual operation or functionality, which is performed off chain.
Okay.
And are you okay? Did you want us to just respond
Yeah, so
on the chat for some of these questions?
No. So what I'd like for you to do is actually read that question. I'm going to give you some time to absorb that question on the chat from Alex, because it's an interesting question. And I'll move on to one of my other questions. So let me actually pose this one to Gary. He mentions that with his Colorado law, and there's also a California law, and I believe one other state is mandating the use of some form of blockchain technologies, but you just heard an earful about confidential smart contracts and other things. So I wanted to ask, how is the landscape regarding the governance of these kind of blockchains? Is it fast enough? Is it going in the right direction? Do you think that it's hopeless, or whatever commentary you want? I mean, you were charged, you are participating in the Colorado State efforts in this regard. So
I definitely think it's moving in the right direction overall. I think that there's a rocky road on this one to get us there. When you look at like what Governor Newsom just put out, and even what we put out back in 2018, the charge at the time was explore the use of, right? It wasn't, it on some level, it mandates the use of blockchain technologies, but it doesn't talk about how, when, where, right? So, the issues that Mick is bringing up, I think are very poignant to that, we need to be able to do this in a way, where we're separating out that private and the public information, right? The blockchain is not an end all be all solution for any of these problems, but it can be part of the solution on the integrity and things like that of the transactional data. I don't see it as being a solution on the private part of the data. So the work that we've been doing is separating out that public and private, just like Mick was just talking about. So I think that's where we're going. And I'm seeing, what California is doing and others, again, they're looking, it's almost like they're trying to jump on the bandwagon at this point. So I think the earlier adopters are going to be the ones that are driving the technology. And then when you bring in the legal aspect of what's going on, I think that once we get all of this put together, we're going to start working this into the right direction. And I think you're going to see all the other states that are trying to get on the bandwagon lining up with the work that's being done.
Okay, now, Mick, you've had a chance to look at the question from Alex on the line having to do with smart contract blockchain systems.
Yeah. So this notion of sort of full anonymity, and this is kind of, Michael S. and Anna are coming at this from one perspective, which is traditional finance, traditional understandings of privacy being brought to bear on blockchain. And the flip side is that you have a social community of I don't want to say believers in the blockchain who have a fundamental assumption that anonymity is a good thing and a necessary thing, and they are driving those technologies in that direction. Just because we have Monero does not mean it's being used for bad purposes. We have Monero in part because people care about anonymity in their transactions, and they have a very real belief that that avoiding governmental control is a good thing. This is a fundamental conflict that's going to happen between regulatory environments and the sort of traditional blockchain communities. And it's going to play out in very different ways. You're going to see blockchains that are very focused on anonymity. Monero and others are great examples of that. I would even point to Zcash as one of the first attempts in that space as well. You're going to see blockchains that are focused on anonymity, and they are going to be, as a result of their lack of regulatory control, they will be constrained in the implications or the financial implications, the financial impact that they can have. And at the other end of the spectrum, you're going to find blockchains that are going to try to work with the regulatory environments, and they're going to bring in those individuals to participate who are much less concerned about sort of philosophical beliefs around the requirements for privacy and anonymity. And because they're going to address or provide access to a larger community, they're likely to end up with more value than the others. And I say likely because who really knows? But the conflict and the tension that exists between the push for anonymity and the push for predictability, which comes along with regulatory control, has to resolve itself somehow. It doesn't have to resolve itself exclusively on either end of the spectrum, but it has to resolve itself.
Yeah, so when you said more value in the last two sentences from the end, what did you mean? More general acceptance be used for?
So here's a simple example. I've got $1,000 that I want to invest. And I have three options for doing. One is that I can go to a traditional stock market where the behavior is heavily regulated. Option two, at the other end of the spectrum, is that I can go buy a bunch of Zcash, right? Or pick your favorite fully anonymized system that way. And option three is that I can throw it into a DAO that is adhering to certain sets of regulatory controls for anonymity or for pseudonymity that allow me to understand the reputation and past behavior of not just the DAO, but the individuals who are participating in the DAO, right? Where do I put my money? There are going to be some people who are going to look at Zcash and say this creates it's high risk, but it creates a potential for high return. There are going to be some people who are going to put it in the stock market because it's predictable and it's known and it's understandable. And there are some who are going to say, I want to take a little bit of risk in this DAO, but I don't really want to lose my money to somebody who's going to come in and rip it off because there's some bad code in it. So which risk profile represents the largest population? What we have found is that the risk profile that represents the largest population tends to be the more conservative approach. The risk profile for the investment and the speculators represents a relatively small, very active, but relatively small community compared to the sort of expectations of I have $1 and I can take it into Starbucks and they're going to cash it for a cup of coffee for me.
That's an interesting perspective, one that saddens me as a technologist, because I never kind of equated cryptology, cryptographic stuff in cryptocurrency as an investment, right? You just characterized where am I going to put my money as if it was an investment. I don't know what Satoshi Nakamoto would say, but the thesis that he had was a peer-to-peer exchange of value and not necessarily something that would make you in US dollars some sort of investment return. So that's that brings me to another side comment just before I go back to the questions in the chat. I think we have enough time for those. And maybe this is to Michael and Anna, and you kicked it off, Mick. Do you consider cryptocurrencies more of a currency or a commodity, or what do you mostly consider public permissionless blockchain cryptocurrency to be?
I'll jump in on that. So I'm going to give the lawyer answer here, but it is very much dependent on the particular cryptocurrency and frankly, as well as use case. And so to give an example of how fact specific it is, something like Bitcoin or Ether, we haven't gotten a ton of hard comfort from regulators, but so far they've not really treated those themselves as securities. But in Canada, for example, if you keep that kind of decentralized cryptocurrency on an exchange, that underlying contract then becomes a security. And some of that really originates from the Quadriga context that I mentioned earlier. Sorry, I'm in between the light and the dark there, where there was widespread fraud found on an exchange, which was a custodial exchange. And so the position of Canadian securities regulators has been, if you've got a custodial exchange, even if the underlying token itself is not a security, it then becomes a security. And so the very same asset may or may not be a security, depending on how it's custodied. And so it becomes essentially impossible to say, as a whole, what are these things? Because there are a lot of different things, and the same thing may be different things. And so that's really a nightmare from a legal perspective. But at the end of the day, what it means is you definitely have to have eyes on it from a securities perspective, from an anti-money laundering perspective, because those are the two areas where the regulators have really been aggressive in claiming jurisdiction. And so that also leads to areas where you've got something that is subject to double regulation, which has been very painful for the industry, and certainly we've got clients that wrestle with that. I think in some ways you've got over regulation because a number of different regulators have moved into the area without necessarily coordinating between themselves. So essentially the short answer is there are a lot of different things. There are surprisingly many things. And so you do have to be a bit careful in terms of how you look at them in order to make sure that you're compliant.
Yeah. Just as an aside, Anna, I believe that differentiation is lost on most people that I present blockchain and crypto mechanics on. I was at the University of South Florida, and I said, well, do you have self-custody of your crypto? Does the blockchain know you as a physical, public address? And their eyes rolled over the back of their head, and they said, well, no, I have it on Robinhood or Venmo or PayPal, I forget which, right? Or some custodial exchange that basically, they're buying the crypto on the behalf of the person investing in them, and they've got no clue about the difference. That if you hold your own keys, there's a certain kind of treatment in certain jurisdictions, and if you give it to a custodial agent like a Binance or a Coinbase or something like that, it's an entirely different relationship. And I find that the common people that say I own crypto have absolutely no clue about that differentiation. I'll just leave that as a parting comment that I think that there's more education to do with the general population on that. And it doesn't have very much to do explicitly with the privacy and security dimensions that we're talking about today. We're getting close to the end. I want to ask Michael Scherman one question before we end, because he seems to have gotten the shorter end of the sticks and on the answers there. So the internet began as U.S. government ARPA project, is now divorced from NTIA and is really governed by the global internet community. If you were like king of the world, do you see a similar path for blockchain, or do you think that this is a good path? Do you recommend another path? What about general governance of the entire blockchain ecosystem? This could be maybe different for currency kind of exchange blockchains or commodity or some other. But if you rule the world, would you like a closed control or an open control? The open control is the problem, is that whose neck do you wring, right? These people could be all over the world. They could be in non-SWIFT, non-G20 countries. So the regulations.
Yeah.
So how would you do blockchain governance for large, important blockchains?
Yeah. So I mean, you mentioned the internet governance is sort of a not regulated by any government. It's not done by any government. It's sort of community based. Maybe this is just the lawyer coming out of me, or we're all sort of a product of our past experiences. But I look at the internet and I see nothing but every government regulating it. I mean, it's almost every aspect of it, whether it's criminal or intellectual property or notice and takedown requirements or whatever. I mean, I think one of the concerns, or one of the issues that needs to be resolved is every government has 10, and there's so many laws, it actually becomes problematic to operate in some instances because there's no consistency. So I mean, if I ran the world, I would at least just hope for a greater degree of consistency, so at least the rules were more common across it all. But on the governance and the regulatory side, maybe I'll just circle back to Mick's comment to end that out. I mean, Mick, you noted that there's sort of like a spectrum of approaches that will be taken, right from the fully anonymous to sort of the middle ground, or the traditional markets. I just wanted to point out that from like a privacy and a regulatory standpoint, I mean, the approaches there differ a lot as well, right? When you're at a fully anonymous blockchain, you're not going to really have too much concerns with your privacy regulators, right? Privacy issues sort of to an extent go out the window, but you are going to have a lot more concerns or issues being raised from other regulators in various countries, like AML, right? A fully anonymous blockchain out there, that's where they're going to start getting involved. And then when they start getting involved and start imposing their requirements, then full anonymity becomes harder to achieve, and you sort of push back to the other end of the spectrum. So it's a bit of a dynamic dance in that sense of trying to align what the community is trying to achieve, or the blockchain is trying to achieve, and sort of getting that right Goldilocks fit.
Very good. And one parting question, we're getting close to in time. I'll ask of Gary. I think that there was a misunderstanding on my part. I thought that the Colorado Senate bill that you mentioned actually mandated use of blockchain. I think I heard you say that the mandate is basically to research this and come back with recommendations. I was a little confused on that comment.
The initial legislation in 2018 was for the investigation of it, but ultimately it did lay the path for mandating it as well. So,
well, very good. I always hated it when I was in non-virtual conferences, when the conference when a given session went over. I'm going to try to honor that now by ending only like a minute or so early. There was one other question in the chat that I didn't address, but I didn't think it was well, you can answer it, Mick, if you want. It had to do with mining and computing resources for doing specialized operations, and probably wanted your position in Intel on that subject. So I kind of avoided that. But if you want to address, I guess that was the Mick to everyone. Okay, that was anyway, you can do that. So I'd like to personally thank all of the panelists here. I think we have a really interesting set of constraints going forward. This is not an easy issue. I really like the progression that Mick has promised me, that we're really further along on confidential smart contracts than what it would appear. I'm a little bit bummed that some blockchains will thrive on anonymity and attract a lot of that money laundering activity. I don't know what the answers are here, but I think you've all collectively given your perspective on these subject areas. I'm pretty sure that some of the audience participants may have a question for one or more of you, and I'd ask that you check your messaging inputs on that regard. With that, I'd like to thank you all. Every one of the panelists will be getting an email from me tomorrow, because I've got to run off right now. I really appreciate all of your time here, and a virtual hand clap from everybody that's in the audience on mute for everybody here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.